everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the second in the Preparing to Pivot webinar series. Today we're going to be focusing on reimagining collaboration. And so that will be the topic of today's webinar for those of you that are just joining us right now. This is a part of a four-part series. But before we begin, we want to just acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous land. And as settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. And we recognize the land as part of our ongoing commitment to truth and reconciliation and making it real in our communities. I'd like to also begin by thanking our webinar series host. This is part of a four-part webinar series. We're on the second webinar, and today we're going to focus on reimagining collaboration. And those of you that participated in our first webinar last week, you'll know that we spent some time thinking about, what's just happened over the course of the pandemic, and how are we now starting to kind of both take stock and begin to look forward. So reimagining collaboration is the second webinar, and actually we'll spend a little time today really thinking about, okay, so how have our collaborations either deepened or weakened over the course of the last several months? And then how might we, as we begin to pivot back into, delivering programs and services in our community and really rebuilding our organizations, how do we reimagine the notion of collaboration? And that's the key element of the webinar today. Next week, we'll be looking at reinventing engagement. So that's all part of the series. So hi, I'm Liz Weaver, and I'm the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and I have the lead responsibility for thinking about collaborative leadership and building the practice of collaborative leadership. For those of you that don't know about Tamarack, we actually are an organization that is based in Waterloo, Ontario, but we work pan-Canadian. My role and responsibility fits within the Learning Center, which is that top circle on the slide. And as you can see, I lead the collaborative leadership area, but we also in the Learning Center focus on practice areas like collective impact and community engagement, community of innovation, and evaluating impact. And we also work at Tamarack with communities across Canada, the US, and other places in our Vibrant Communities portfolio. And we have three initiatives that fall under our Vibrant Communities portfolio. There's an initiative around reducing poverty, another initiative around deepening community, and a third one on communities building youth futures. And what's interesting about the work in community is that we're now working with about 700 communities across Canada and the United States in these three topic areas. So it's quite exciting to bring the knowledge of community into the practice of community change. Before we go into a lot more detail about the, reimagining collaboration, one of the things that we thought we would do is a quick little sign-in exercise for you. And this is one where you can use your, enter in to the chat box, kind of how you're doing today. And so here's a nice little temperature grid that you can see. So it starts with red. You might be feeling totally overloaded, stressed, and angry, or on edge. And in the case of red, you need support or space for you to really be able to, move and change your status. In the blue, you might be feeling sad or depressed. You might have grief, fear, or loss of control. And again, you might need support. So this temperature check tool is actually a really great tool for when you're meeting with collaborative teams. It's really a great opportunity to take the pulse of the team and to see where they're sitting and how they're feeling. And so I can see that some of you are typing into the chat box some of your reflections in terms of the team status check. I've seen some folks identify yellow, orange. Some of you have put in green, that you're feeling positive and balanced, and that you have, you know, the mental space to reflect. It's kind of interesting to think about, you know, how a group might be feeling, and we might be pushing forward with our agenda, but not necessarily checking in and seeing, you know, a lot of people are juggling many things, or some people in the group have that opportunity now to reflect. And it might be, you know, at the beginning of a meeting, if you use this team status check, it might be a great trigger for you as the person facilitating the meeting to know, you know, how far you can move forward and what might be holding you back. So it's a great tool for you to use. And I thought it was particularly appropriate here for our collaborative reimagining collaboration work. So before we go into the content for today, I wanted to invite Marg Fancy from Every Kid in Our Communities of Leeds Grenville kind of do a quick reflection on the Taking Stock webinar and how it has kind of led to some things that they've thought about with the Every Kid in Our Communities collaborative. So Mark, why don't you share with us a little bit about your reflection and what the first webinar prompted for you?
Thanks. Thank you very much, Liz. Well, I was looking, of course, through the lens of collaboration and our collective work as Every Kid in Our Communities Coalition. And we've had an opportunity not to meet as a whole table as yet, but to talk to various partners in terms of our planning and coordinating committee and other committees that are part of Every Kid. And our conversation really reflected on, again, our collective work and how we are supporting children, youth, and families in Leeds and Grenville. We talked a lot about whether COVID brought increased opportunities for working together, and took a look at things like the many discussions that we've had collectively around supporting staff, supporting our families, some of the coordinated efforts that have been made to provide recreation and leisure for children and youth through online and in-person support. We also talked about reaching out to our families, and that's where we've really had some rich discussion, because the observations that we've had are that many of our agencies are seeing a decrease in requests for service, when, as we know, a crisis or a pandemic has seen spikes in needs for mental health support, increased domestic violence. We're seeing all kinds of online predator activity taking place. So we know that the need is there, but how do we reach our families? And there have been various efforts to do that through promotion of other organizations and agencies' work on social media, community posters developed, sort of that message that we're open for business, efforts to provide information about our community partners in some of the resource kits that are being sent to children and youth as part of the leisure activities. So one of those aha moments that we've had, and my caveat here is these have been discussions with small groups of our coalition members, and we haven't had the opportunity to take this to the whole group as yet. But we've been really talking about, you know, whether COVID has provided us with opportunities to move towards more formalized service planning. And we've always talked about coordinated service plans, service integration, and of course our Ontario government has mandated, legislated coordinated service planning for children and youth with multiple special needs. So in our conversations, we've been really saying, can we take a look at some of the research and the work that's been done around some of that planning, and build on it. Look at the lessons that were learned, some of the opportunities that may exist to start reflecting again on some of those phrases like every door is the right door, things we've tried to work towards but maybe haven't been deliberate about, and seamless services. And can we take this as an opportunity to really build on our foundational practices? So that's kind of where our conversations have been leading. I think to go back to last week's workshop, Liz, I think one of the things has been having that structured framework to ask the questions and to move forward. We've revisited those questions many times and will continue to do so. They really help build a structure around the conversation, and I think that's been a really key learning for us. So thanks.
Thank you, Mark. It's interesting. I know you and I had a quick little conversation yesterday, and it's interesting to think about this webinar series as an opportunity to prompt those structured conversations. And so if you look at the series, we have 3 webinars in a row, and then we're coming to the 4th webinar where we will collectively build a pivot plan. And so we're hoping, the intent of this webinar is to create those opportunities like every kid in our communities has done in terms of that early stage reflection, but then to use the tools and the resources that are presented as part of each webinar to have a formal way of diving into the conversation. And it seems like, Mark, that's what you all have been doing in your collaborative and in the conversations that you've been having. So what we want to do, you can see on this slide that we invite others to maybe reflect on your progress. If you want to just put something into the chat box, that would be great. We'll come back at it perhaps a little bit later, but it really is the intent of these webinars, as I mentioned, is that kind of opportunity to have a structured kind of reflection process. So if we move on to the goals for today's webinar around reimagining collaboration, we want to take the opportunity today to think about how has the collaboration that you've been involved in Leeds Grenville, how has it evolved during the pandemic? And I had some conversations earlier with Trisha and Marg, and one of the things that they were telling me about Leeds Grenville, and something that we've seen in other communities, whether it's Kingston, Lennox Addington, or Hamilton, or other communities across Canada, is that with the pandemic, the collaborative networks that existed in the community have been strengthened or deepened or called upon to work. And so we're going to explore that a little bit. We're going to talk about some of the keys to successful collaboration, just to remind you of those. And then we have some exercises for you to do, which you can do either during the workshop or post-webinar, which really help you kind of think about your current collaborative context and then leveraging collaboration post-pandemic. And for those of you that joined us on the webinar last week, we talked about how to navigate a pandemic and post-pandemic world. And this comes from our colleague at Tamarack, Mark Cabage, and he says, there's possibly 3 futures that we're looking towards, right? So we've gone through this disruption, and the futures are that we might return to the old equilibrium, but that's probably unlikely. We might find this new equilibrium where things will have shifted, the ways that we're working, some of the partnerships that we have, some of the resources that might be available to us, or we might be going into this kind of new disequilibrium, right? Where there will be, the shift of the pandemic, but then we're going to kind of see other shifts that kind of come forward post-pandemic. And it might be, changes in resource availability. It might be that some of the organizations that we partnered with in the past don't have the resources to partner with us in the future. It might be, as Marg mentioned, we know that the need for our services is great, but we're actually seeing a decline in the requests. And so, as you can see in this kind of new disequilibrium, it's really thinking about how do we move forward in that. So today we're focusing on collaboration within this new, these kind of different futures that might be coming forward. And I always like to return to the collaborative premise. This comes from the work of David Crislip, and he wrote a field book about collaborative leadership a number of years ago. And what he talks about in the collaborative premise is helpful, right? If you bring the appropriate people together in constructive ways with good information, they will create authentic visions and strategies for the shared concerns of the community or the organizations. And so what I love to pull out of this premise is this notion of appropriate people. You don't need to have everybody at the table, but you need the right people who can provide you with solutions or with paths forward around the table. And you need to support them in constructive ways with good information. So those elements of the collaborative premise are so critical. Crislip goes on to say that there are things that have to be agreed to around your collaborative tables, right? So the shared agreements are things like, this is what we're going to work on together. And that we need to work together to solve this thing, whatever it is, right? This problem, this opportunity, this change that we're trying to work on together. We need to define and determine how we will work together. And we do need to kind of have information that says, this is our shared information. So lots of us will work in different kinds of organizations and have a lens on a piece of information, but maybe not the full 360 picture. And so by bringing lots of different people together, the appropriate people together around a table, we start to build, it's kind of like puzzle pieces, right? We start to complete the different puzzle pieces and bring each of the pieces together to complete the puzzle. And we need a shared definition of the problem or the opportunity, and actually figure out what are the steps that we're going to take together that will move us forward. Some of the challenges that we see in a collaborative context are things, and these appear often, right? So, a challenge might be that the membership contributions in the collaborative are not equal, right? Or, we're sitting at the table, but we're not showing up fully as an organization and committing our organization and our organizational resources to this, or members aren't clear about the problem, or the organization is not engaged. Sometimes problems show up or challenges show up in terms of decision making, that we don't really have good decision making processes in place, or governance. We don't really understand, or don't have a mode or a structure for how we're going to govern ourselves. Is everyone a leader? Does everyone have equal say, or is someone convening us and pulling the coordination of the collaborative together? In collective impact, we've seen the building of things like backbone infrastructures, and that is really the convening role. So there, in a governance way, there's a individual or a group of individuals that take the lead in convening. And so it's kind of interesting to think about, sometimes when we're working collaboratively, we hit a roadblock because we don't define governance in a way that is helpful to the other members of the collaborative. And then the final thing that I wanted to kind of share with you as background around collaboration is really thinking about some of the other considerations that are relevant for effective collaboration. And these slides are kind of connected to one another, but there's some nuances between the slides. And so, when you look to bringing people around a collaborative table, you want to think about, okay, so if this is a problem or an opportunity that we want to really lean into, what's the influence of the members to really get traction on this problem or opportunity? Can they bring others to the table? Do they have deeper connections in the community? What's their commitment? What's the diversity of knowledge, experience, and expertise that comes around the table? You know, how's our communication going to happen? Is it going to be formal? Are we going to send out minutes after every collaborative meeting, or is it going to be more formal or a more informal where, you know, we have high level meeting notes with key decisions and not necessarily really following that formal process? What's the leadership style? And what's our group culture? Is our group our collaborative culture such that we're very risk oriented and we're really gonna push out at the boundaries, or are we going to be risk averse? Are we going to be working in the safe zone? And so, you know, these are things to consider when you're building a collaborative, but they're also really important to consider as we're reimagining collaborative and collaboration, you know, and really thinking about, you know, who are the members that we have around our current table, to what degree have we, you know, really thought about these characteristics and considerations, and to what degree can we, as we begin to, you know, go into the next phase post-pandemic, to begin to think about collaboration in a different kind of way. I did have an opportunity for questions, and if you want to put some of your questions into the chat box, we invite you to do that. What we'll do is I'll present the next slide, and then we'll come back at the questions in a minute or so. So the next slide is really kind of thinking about what just happened in terms of our collaborative work in Leeds Grenville. And so maybe if you have a moment and a slip of paper close to your desk, you want to think about what have you accomplished at your collaborative table, both individually, what have you contributed to the collaborative, but what has the collaborative also accomplished over the last couple of months, let's say since March of this year. So we're a couple of months into the pandemic, so think about that. Are there opportunities that you might have missed during this period? So there might have been some new funding opportunity, or there might have been an opportunity to provide different kinds of services. So Marg, in her kind of reflection on every kid in the community, the opportunities that they perceive as a collaborative to be missing right now are things like, you know, the decline in the number of people asking them for support, right? And so they're already identifying that as an opportunity that they might have missed, or an opportunity that they can now lean into as they go forward. And so we're inviting you in the chat box to reflect really quickly. And so I saw a couple pop up. So Duncan, what have we been seeing in the chat box?
Yeah, lots of good responses so far. We had a question from earlier. It's from Tina, and they asked, when first convening the group, do you actually have as one of the first agenda items discussion about risk tolerance, or is that something that evolves or becomes clear as there may be differences within the group?
That's a really great question. I would probably start off the conversation with what is the problem we're trying to solve, and get a good understanding of that problem or opportunity that we're trying to move forward. And once you've had a good opportunity, then you want to talk about what are the boundaries in which we want to work. And so that would help surface kind of the risk and the level of risk tolerance. Or you might ask the more direct question, so how risk tolerant would we be? So what are the elements that we might push against to move this forward? Do we see our role as being, strong, having a strong advocacy focus? Do we see our role as working quietly with, with partners in government? So that's where those kinds of conversations would happen. I see it as an early conversation, but I think defining the problem is almost the first conversation, and then talking about the boundaries related to that definition is the second conversation. And then, coming out of your conversation about risk, you might say something like, who else should we be inviting to the table in order to move forward beyond the, through the boundaries that we've identified for ourselves. So that's kind of the order that I would follow.
No, that's great. We have a number of accomplishments and challenges.
Great.
The first challenge, many competing priorities, which I think makes sense given how many yellows we saw in the temperature check, right? Multiple things you're having to juggle.
Yeah.
In terms of accomplishments, trainings and learning together, collaborative projects, refined focus, supporting each other, sharing information and change in services during the pandemic. So lots of kind of connected ideas there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think what we've heard at Tamarack in terms of, the partners that we've surveyed as part of our poverty reduction initiative, our Cities Reducing Poverty, is that we do see during a pandemic, it seems almost counterintuitive, but we see that groups and collaboratives come together even more frequently, and they become like a support network for one another. And so that's been reflected, I think, Duncan, in some of the comments that you've seen, and also some of the ones that I saw kind of pop up on my screen as well. And you would think that, we're all going into our own separate work environments by working remotely, and yet we're connecting more. And so that's really interesting to kind of consider in terms of thinking about collaborative work, and then thinking about, as we move forward, how do we leverage this? What are the new partnerships that we might be able to leverage going forward? So if we go to the next slide, there's an opportunity here for even deeper reflection and sense making, right? And so again, it's kind of like, what enabled us to respond well when we were able to support one another? What else or what more do we wish for? And and what are the things that we can be taking into the next phase of the work to go forward? And this is something that these set of questions are something that you can do with your collaborative group and get them to kind of do some sense making and dialogue around. So as we think about reimagining collaboration, we really want to think about the things about reimagining that are critical. So if we could go to the next slide, there are two elements that you particularly want to focus on. And one is, in the first webinar, we talked about our purpose and the value that we provide to our communities and to the people that access our programs and services. And so when you're thinking about reimagining collaboration, as Marg said, they've been thinking at Every Kid in Our Communities work about, their core purpose, and is their core purpose shifting, or are they? She said, we're actually thinking about our core purpose and recognizing that the conversations that we had early about our core purpose are ones that we need to revisit and even go deeper on, right? So part of reimagining collaboration is actually going back into that core purpose and saying, okay, so has our core purpose during this time of pandemic and moving forward, what has shifted in our core purpose? So leaning back a little bit into some of that work that we did in webinar 1, and then thinking about collaboration in a way that it increases these factors, right? It increases our opportunity to be more resilient as a collaborative, to open some new doors, and to bring to light some of those opportunities that we may not necessarily have foreseen, right? Because as I showed you, there are 3 possible futures. And so it really is thinking about those 3 possible futures and thinking about our collaborative in that way. This slide really starts to help you and help your collaborative kind of think about this in those 3 possible ways, right? So the response way, the kind of building back to the new normal, the recover way, which is where we are right now. So it's asking questions like, who can we work with to bring a new idea forward? So are there new people that we can bring into our collaborative, or new organizations that we can bring into our collaborative that would help jumpstart our idea. And so, you know, is there a new partnership? So in the case of Every Kid in Our Community, is there a new partnership that we can bring forward that will help us really kind of think about getting out to people who might want to access our programs and services, and what might that look like? What are the values or capabilities that our collaborative or our organization might bring to other organizations in the collaborative? And then looking further into the future, there's a question here about how can we use the collaborative work to really get to that kind of high level transformation that we're looking for in our communities. So reimagining collaboration has 3 core elements that you want to focus on. You want to look for the strengths of the collaborative in the current context. You want to look at some of the gaps, things that you didn't respond to effectively, or that might be gaps in terms of your membership or your decision-making processes, or the risk tolerance that you have, those kinds of things, those elements, those considerations that I showed in a previous slide, those are good reflection points for thinking about some of the gaps. And then you want to think about, how do we co-create? How do we use our collaborative thinking as a way of co-creating even more effective transitions for us? And so we've got a couple of tools for you to dive into. These tools are on the slide deck, which will be sent to you after this webinar, but some of them are also in the workbook, so that you have had access to. Maybe not all of them are in the workbook, and so you'll get the slide deck as well. So the first one is to really start to look into patterns. And this comes out of the IDEO COVID-19 Business Challenge. It was more focused at businesses, not necessarily the community sector, but I think it's a really great tool to kind of begin to look at the patterns that are emerging, right? And in this tool, what you start to identify are what are some of the strengths that we bring, and then some of the gaps that we might have in our potential partnerships or our partnerships moving forward. Or you could even use this for some of the existing partnerships that you have around your collaborative table. So you could use it both facing inward to your collaborative table, or alternatively, you could use it facing outward for your collaborative table or your organization, and thinking about, okay, so we've seen COVID hit us, or COVID exist. We've reacted in this kind of way. As we go post-pandemic, reflecting on how our core purpose has shifted, here are some potential other partnerships that we might need to seed and grow going forward. And so it's kind of interesting, right, to be much more methodical in how you consider, you know, your partnerships. And the example that they give here is kind of interesting, and one that we've had to deal with at Tamarack a little bit, but some of you might have to in your organizations. So how do you go to a contactless online payment system, right? And so if you have people that are registering for workshops or are making donations to your organization, what might you do? And so there are some potential partnerships that you might enter into. Or if you're you know, wanting to increase your reach and scope, another example that's given in this slide is, you know, we have limited reach due to in-person coaching and consulting. And so could we get our message out via the local radio, or could we do it through social media? And who are the local partners? Should we invite the radio host to be a podcast, engage in a podcast with us? The next slide helps us kind of go a little bit deeper again with reimagining collaboration. And so this is something that you can use, this tool you can use both within your current collaborative table, or you could also use it within your organization. And it's a little bit of again, opportunity to both reflect about the current context, but begin to look forward to the next phase, right? And so it's the 4 areas that you might note is, and you know, I would envision using this if I was in a collaborative table. You could use this, let's say, at every kid in our community's table, have each person fill it in individually, right? So what can we provide to others? You might split the first box. What can we provide? And what are we in need of? Who are the organizations that we need to partner with in order to, or in order to accomplish what we're hoping to accomplish? Organizations that fit this profile are, and then people we can reach out to are. And so it's more than just a broad brainstorming. It actually enables you to seed some conversations in a way that you can begin to reflect on, you know, both what you have in terms of your current collaborative, but also if you're looking at some of the gaps in your purpose or what you're trying to accomplish together, you can use this. Another tool that we use often at Tamarack is a tool that we call the collaboration spectrum. And some of you may have seen this tool before, and we'll add in a link to the resource for the collaboration spectrum. It's at the end of the, it's in the Tamarack resources, but we'll add in a link as well into the chat box and into the time we have together. So the collaboration spectrum is a tool where you can, as a collaborative, ask people in the collaborative to identify where they think the collaborative work is situated right now on the spectrum and where they hope the collaborative work will go moving forward. And so often we will give people dots and we'll ask people individually to, on the spectrum, place their dots, right? And typically what we see is that even though you have a lot of people sitting around your collaborative table, some of them have assumptions that, you know, the collaboration is really only there to communicate with one another. And others might assume that the collaboration is there to coordinate programs and services. And so by identifying where you are right now and where you hope to go on the collaboration spectrum, what you're essentially doing is you're creating a path of moving your collaborative forward. And it's a really kind of nice way of getting agreement about what are some of the core purposes. And again, you know, you might tie in the risk conversation into this conversation as well. You can see that there's 2 elements connected to the collaboration spectrum called turf and trust. And at the level of competition, we know that there's increased levels of turf and the organizations are more loosely coupled together. And then as you begin to kind of talk about coordinating, collaborating, potentially integrating programs and services, you really have to increase the levels of trust around your collaborative table. And so this tool, the collaboration spectrum, can be really helpful when you're thinking about taking your collaboration to the next level. It's also really interesting to think about collaboration as having a bunch of different ways that it expresses itself. And this list of different types of collaboration options comes from a group in the UK called Collaborate. So look up their website. It's on the list of websites that we've provided. So they talk about collaboration as not being just one thing, right? It's a little bit like the spectrum, but they actually define in the resource that they have these different collaboration options. And so as you're thinking about moving your collaboration forward and reimagining it, you want to think about what's our current context that we are in, and then where might we go? And so a networked collaboration is a loose collaboration amongst between autonomous individuals and organizations. And this is where you have, you know, distinct organizations in the community, but they're loosely connected. And they come together as a network to move a piece of work forward, but then they dissipate relatively quickly, right? It's not something that exists for a long term. collective impact. Many of you have probably heard about collective impact is a structured form of collaboration with kind of 5 core elements to it, including backbone infrastructure. And so the collaboration is defined by a common agenda, which the set of actors determine and agree to work together to advance a common agenda. There are catalyst collaborators, which are partners that are working to drive systems change forward. So their focus is really pushing at the systems change agenda or the policy agenda. And an example of a catalyst collaborator is with our Vibrant Community Cities Reducing Poverty Network. There's a group of folks that are working on advancing a living wage conversation. And so they are a set of communities across Canada that are really focused on, living wage and the engagement of business leaders around this idea of a living wage. And so they're trying to really shift how systems are and how people are being paid in communities and through businesses. There are coalitions and mission-oriented collaborations. And so I would invite you to read this document by Collaborate in terms of these different kinds of collaboration options. And so the final bit of this in terms of rethinking or reimagining our collaborative work is to kind of invite you to consider building a prototype for your collaborative. Now, it might be a prototype that looks at a certain element of your collaborative, or it might look at the collaborative as a whole. What do we want to accomplish in the next phase? And so the things that, in terms of building a prototype, the things that you want to consider are, how do we use our metaphors? How do we tell stories around the designing of our prototype, and then what are the keys that are going to unlock that prototype? There are core steps to follow, 7 core steps to follow in terms of prototyping. And in the first webinar, we invited you to prototype around your core purpose. In this webinar, the homework that leads into our 4th webinar is really to think about, okay, for our collaboration specifically, what are we going to focus on that that we want to do as a prototype for our collaboration? So the steps around building a prototype are identifying what we want to shift, the problem or the opportunity, framing a question. So if we go back to what Marg was talking about at the beginning of this session, her question was, how do we get better at letting people know about our programs and services and meeting their needs? Because intuitively, we know that the needs have increased, but what we're seeing is this pattern of people accessing us decreasing. So that's the question. Then they want to generate possibilities. So really think about, okay, so how could our collaborative, what could our collaborative do in a way that works differently, that generates a whole bunch of different possibilities? Have everybody in the collaborative brainstorm that. Then talk about what would have to be true in our community to answer that question, right? Or to actually lean into some of these possibilities. So it would be true that we would have to get our message out more. It would be true that we might have to figure out how to reach those people that possibly need our programs and services in new and innovative ways. It might be true that we have to build some new collaborative partnerships with people that we haven't necessarily worked with in the past. People in social media, people, in the radio station, people in other networks, acknowledge some of the barriers that you have, and then kind of think about, okay, so what is the plan? What are the next steps that we're going to take, the testing and learning, and then moving forward? So that's the prototype model that we talked about last time, but this time we're really going to focus on reimagining collaboration in terms of building this prototype. And so this page really helps you kind of it really helps to take you through the key steps of the prototyping model. So before we end this session, we want you to kind of put a question or two into the chat box around collaboration. Have some questions that you're considering around collaboration, or if you're observing any shifts that are happening in the collaborative work that you're doing, whether it's collaboration with a group in the community or collaboration within your organization. So Duncan, do we have any comments, any shifts that you've been observing as we've been going through the content of the webinar?
Yeah, there have been lots of interesting contributions. I'll pull one from the Q&A panel. And as Liz mentioned, if anyone has a question, hasn't asked it yet, feel free to use the Q&A panel to submit it. This question comes from an anonymous attendee, and they said, pre-COVID, lots of folks were afraid to move forward with change and take risks. COVID has changed the conversation by necessity. How do we harness this to be the new normal?
Yeah, so that's such a good question. And I think, you know, part of the intent of this webinar series is to give you tools to probe that a little bit deeper, right? To start to look at, you know, what are we doing well? Where have we built some new partnerships? Where have we been able to kind of come together? And then how do we build that into something something more formalized, right? So is it, you know, what we're doing really well is we're communicating far more often with our partners and engaging in a regular pattern of connection and communication. So then you want to think about, okay, so then how do we build that into the next phase of our work, recognizing that we're going to get a lot busier, right? And so a way that I might do that is I might probe, if you look particularly at communication, what's working well right now? Do people feel like short, frequent communications are really keeping them connected to the collaborative work? And then how do you build short, frequent communications into future work that you're doing? Or is the communications or the way that you're working, you're starting to ask more challenging questions and open that up to conversation and dialogue? That's something that we're doing at Tamarack, you know, during this period of shifting, is we're bringing far more of our questions that might have sat in a certain area at Tamarack. We're bringing it to the whole group and asking the whole group to, you know, have conversations, and then that leads to better results in the longer term because different perspectives are being raised. And so, you know, I think that's it's a opportunity right now. We have this opportunity right now to reflect back on what's working, what's maybe not working quite as well, and then to start to also ask the question, if these things are working and we're getting better at these things, how do we bring them forward? How do we bring them into our practice going forward? So Duncan, any other questions, any other comments that you're seeing?
Yeah, great. Next question is also from an anonymous attendee. And they ask, how do you reduce the fear to co-create? Lots of people seem to be afraid to be open to others' perspectives and identify other ideas. How can you open people's minds who have been a part of the same table for many years and are used to the same old processes?
That's another really great question. I think the way that I have seen that happen successfully is there are two pieces of work that need to be done. One is to get a deeper understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve together or the opportunity that you're trying to lean into. And so that would be looking at what's the data tell us about that problem or opportunity, and how does that data either help us understand it or actually raise some new questions for us. There's a great tool that the Urban Institute has developed called a data walk. And so the kind of idea of a data walk is that you have, okay, so we want to reduce poverty in our community, for example, right? That might be your core thing that you're trying to work on together. And then what the group who's facilitating the data walk does is they identify 5 or 6 or 10 pieces of data that might be relevant to that core thing that you're trying to do together. And they put the data up around a room. So this would require an in-person meeting, but you could figure out how to do it as well virtually. So you would put up these different pieces of data, and you would ask the question, how is this data connected to the core purpose? What are the things about, what does the data reveal about that core purpose? And, you know, so often what happens in collaborative groups is that we look at data, but we don't give people the opportunity to interpret the data from their lens, right? And so a data walk process allows each of us, without the kind of overarching interpretation, it allows each of us to say, hey, that piece of data, yeah, in my organization and from my view, that's what this data means, and this is how it connects to the core purpose, right? And I think that the data walk process, the couple of times that we facilitated it at Tamarack, it's really allowed individuals and groups around the collaborative to hear each other in a different kind of way, but also to make sense of data in a different kind of way. So that's one thing that you could do, is using data to help you kind of understand the problem from different perspectives. The other thing that we use a lot, particularly with brand new groups, is this question, why is it important that I'm here? And you invite everybody in the room. So you say, okay, so we're wanting to reduce poverty in our community. Why is it important that you've made the time to join us and to tackle this pretty complex issue? And what I've learned as I've facilitated that question is it takes you beyond, you know, the kind of organizational commitment to that kind of personal commitment of why people are thinking that, you know, it is important to be around that table. So often we get to the work, but we don't create those kind of connections between people. And so, and those connections between people help us understand why that issue is important to them. I was facilitating a group in Prince George, and we were working on improving child outcomes. And we asked the question early on, and one person said, you know, I'm the mom of a child with special needs and I can navigate the system, but I know not everybody in my community can. And that's why it's important that I'm here today. And another person said, you know, I'm raising my grandchildren and I know that there aren't as many supports for grandparents raising grandchildren. That's why it's important that I'm here today. And each person in that group had a really important way of saying why, had a really interesting way of saying why it's important that we're here. But it also gave that whole group kind of a lens into, you know, connections that they were building across the group. And so I think building in those personal connections, building in the reflection time, looking at data, those are all critical parts to looking at the problem from a new lens or a new light or a, you know, an individual kind of perspective. And so I would invite you to use some of those tools. And we'll, as we send out some of the materials post this webinar, we'll send out the data walk exercise that the Urban Institute has pulled together, because it's a really great way of trying to have us all make sense of data, but bringing our individual perspectives to that. So we're coming to the end of the webinar today. We invite you post-webinar and in anticipation of the 4th webinar in the series to kind of do a little bit of reflection, go back to your collaborative groups, use some of the tools and resources that we've presented today. Spend some time thinking about collaboration and how collaboration can be reimagined, what you're doing really well, what you've really done well during this time of COVID, and what you want to bring forward. In the workbook and also on the next slide, there are some links to some additional tools and resources. So Duncan, if we could move to the next slide really quickly, I can just highlight a couple of them. So we've got the Business Pivot Challenge link. Tamarack has some resources around collective impact post-pandemic. And we have some links to some resources that are provided by the United Way, both United Way Centraide Canada and also the United Way of Leeds Grenville. Duncan, I'm going to throw it back to you for a minute to talk about what else is available through Tamarack.
Yeah, thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone for being here today. We just have a few short opportunities that might be of interest to you. Throughout the fall, Tamarack's committed to doing free community building webinars each week. These are on a variety of topics such as collaboration and community engagement, leadership, collective impact, and poverty reduction. We have a pretty diverse lineup of webinars coming up in the next few weeks, so I encourage you to check out tamarackcommunity.ca to learn more about those. We also recently launched a new online course on the foundations of community engagement. So if that's the part of this conversation that you're most interested in, I invite you to learn more about this course. It's entirely self-directed. You're able to learn at your own pace. And we also host monthly small group coaching calls to give you more individualized feedback. So that's Foundations of Community Engagement. And again, you can find that at tamarackcommunity.ca. Over to you, Liz.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to joining you all again next week, where we're going to reinvent engagement. So we know that collaboration is something that we do as a group. The engagement webinar is really going to focus on collaboration engagement both within our organizations and our teams, but also engagement in the broader community. And so it's going to be building from the webinar today. And so we hope that many of you, all of you, will join us for our webinar next week. And we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks, everybody.